right. So I wrote this one. You know where I wrote it, but it's the first of the Tales of Jistoa origin stories. The origin stories for the playable characters in Discs of Jistoa. This one is about Coreen Draal. Space pirates meet the rebellion. Captain Drall, we're entering into the atmosphere of Jistoa as we speak. Coreen took a long drag of his cigarette and exhaled. 10-4, Molly. Set a course for Korana. We're going home. Molly, the ship's AI, beeps. Affirmative, Captain. Soon the space cruiser Benihana entered into the stratosphere and began to burn. If not for the heat shields, the craft would have vaporized. Soon the Benihana was floating above the sea. Approximate location 60 degrees west of Tatala, Molly stated. That far off, huh? Coreen scoffed, taking another drag of his cigarette. Next time I'll leave the calculating to you, Molly. I'm only human. He chortled. At this point, his first mate, a Felix named Aris, entered the cabin. Aris saluted Coreen and stood at attention. Lieutenant Aris Taraxis reporting for duty. Ever chipper, Aris joined Coreen 2 years prior. Her demeanor shifted as her face went pale. One sec, boss. She bolted for the latrine and closed the door, hurling. As a general rule, the Felix see technology as an abomination. Aris bucks this trend, having wanted to have adventures in space. As she was being airsick, another of the five-man crew entered. This member being an elf named Kyler Twiz. Blue-haired with ice blue eyes, he was around 7 feet tall, carrying a greatsword. At ease, Kyler, Coreen said, knowing much had been troubling the elf. Kyler had a seat and stared out the window. Another member entered with a blonde... Excuse me. The last member entered with a blonde-haired android following behind him. Another human, an older man and Coreen's mentor, Tyros Galad, quietly sat down opposite of Kyler. He nodded to Coreen as the gynoid walked up to him. They nodded to each other. As you are, Molly. Have a seat. So the gynoid did. He put out his cigarette, and Aris comes out of the toilet, looking frazzled. She quickly had a seat. Finally, Coreen and Molly take their respective seats. All fasten their belts and brace their respective seats. Blah, brain. All fasten their belts and brace for takeoff. Set a course for Korana, Coreen ordered. The Benihana streaks across the sky, homeward bound. The ship soon crossed into the Tatalan airspace and is soon flanked by a pair of Koranan fighters. They looked off like they'd been commandeered. They began to open fire without warning. Brace yourselves. Evasive action, Coreen shouted. As the much larger craft took a number of direct hits, they veered over and crashed into the smaller ship. The fighter exploded in a fireball, but the Benihana sustained some damage. The ship's computer locks on, and the cannon fires a concentrated beam of pure energy at the remaining fighter. It likewise exploded. At this point, the Benihana began to lose altitude. Abandon ship, Coreen ordered as the crew hurried to the escape pod. The five entered and buckled in, and the pod ejected, landing nearby in eastern Tatala near the orcish town of Warbrand. A town built on a bridge over a canyon which spans the longitudinal width of the continent. Warbrand is much like an Old West ghost town, but but it bustles with activity, with orcs, humans, satyr, and even a few industrious Felix. Coreen and company climbed out of the escape pod and made their way into town, each checking their weapons first due to the nature of the landing. Coreen sat cross-legged on a rock and began to meditate. The human closed his red eyes as his black hair began to rise. His hilts floated from the holsters on his hips. Soon, the cylindrical hilts came apart in midair and reformed. As they landed in his hand, he opened his eyes and ignited them, revealing a pair of white plasma blades. He gave each a cursory swing and then shut them off for storage. Aris carried a simple knife of Patalorian design. She swung it once and smiled, wrapping her long tail around her hips. She twitches her long ears and stretches. Kyler finally speaks. "It's coming down," as the Benihana crashed roughly 1 mile from Warbrand. Molly gave the affirmative. Contact with the ship Benihana. Odds of survival 5% after crash. Coreen sighed. Now why would the Koranans attack us, much less in Totalan airspace? After all, I'm an official privateer of Queen Sarara. Aris chimed in. Not only that, but Corana and Avalon are allies. Coreen nodded. Those drones were clearly hacked, but by who? Kyler said, examining his sword. Good question, Kyler, Coreen said as Molly checks her weapon system as well as her submachine guns. Tyros checks his pistol and checks his katana. He swings the katana once and puts it away. Captain, I suggest we make for town. We're sitting ducks out here, he states. Agreed, Tyros. Let's move. It was sunset when they arrived at Warbrand. They were immediately greeted by a deep green orc who wore a set of Koranan power armor. The name's Torask Mumba, Sheriff of Warbrand. I just wanted to warn you, travelers. Everyone is a bit on edge, so mind your P's and Q's. No problem here, but the elf has a chip on his shoulder, Coreen said jokingly. The sheriff leaves them to it, so they head into town and grab dinner at a local barbecue joint and go to bed at the local inn. Before they slept, the four unwound from the day's events. Molly plugged in to recharged, and the combat gynoid shut down. The remaining party members shower one at a time and begin to discuss the events of the day. So what now? Aris began. Our ship is wrecked, our crew is marooned, so is this? No, Coreen interjected. Kyler sighs. Maybe not for you. But it's time I headed home. I miss my wife, he sighs. Yet again. That's fine. I'm going to Avalon to see my Vanessa. Aris bristled. How's she gonna feel when you bring home another girl, Coreen? She asked. She knows about you, and besides, we're not lovers. He laughed. Tyros nods, and so our next stop is Avalon. I think I may return to Corana from there. The old pirate lit up a cigar and took a drag. Coreen lit up a cigarette, and mentor and student shared a smoke. I'm not going back into space, Coreen. I'm getting too old for the universe's third oldest profession, even here on Jistoa. But real talk, the last trip into space nearly ended my life. Tyros takes a drag of his cigar. Coreen is silent for a moment. You've been free to retire for years, Coreen said after another long drag from his cigarette. You're what, 87 years old this year? He asked. 90, actually, Tyros corrected. Hell, I could expire tonight if the Lord decides it's time for me to go home. If anything happens to me, bury me on Belzara, he said, crushing out his cigar. He went to his bed. For now, though, we rest. We may not be out of the woods yet, the old pirate said, tucking himself in. Good night, Sensei, Coreen responded, doing the same in his own bed. Aris sat out on the balcony, staring up at the stars, basking in the night of Jistoa's three moons, Taziz, Mez, and Sal. She came close. She soon closed the window, and also went to bed, leaving Kyler to himself. He pinned a note to his comrades. I have made my way south to Delapex. Stay safe. We will meet again. Fate's willing. Kyler. At that point, Kyler made a quiet exit. Morning dawned, and Aris was the first to rise. She found the note and shared it with the others as they woke up that morning. Tyros was next to rise, grabbing his cigar and heading to the balcony to smoke it. Coreen woke next and headed out for a cigarette. Afterwards, they activated Molly and the four left, crossing the whole of Warbrand before stepping out into the desert. The four trekked across quickly before arriving into a cave nearby. Upon entering the cave, the smell of dust hits their nostrils. Cover your nose and mouth, Aris. This dust will get heavy. It's the reason the Tatalan soldiers wear a gaiter. Tyros, Aris, and Coreen covered their faces and they made their way through the winding cave. If there hadn't been markers throughout, they could have been lost, but eventually they come out into a vast grassland. They walked for a few hours, seeing the occasional loper. A loper is sort of a reptilian rabbit type deal. Not quite a frog, but imagine an iguana hopping like a rabbit. And any number of birds flying high in the sky before sunset. They arrived at a river. This river, while wide, ran from north to south. Further south from here is a small town situated on the river. Oh, shoot. I used the wrong voice. Further south from here is a small town situated on the river, Molly said. I suggest we make our way there to rest. Coreen agreed. Beltex, it's a small Saito town. Just after sunset, the crew entered Beltex and made their way to the local inn. They rented a room, then split up a pizza among them. They ate and rested, and the next morning caught the ferry. On the ferry, there was a crowd of people, including 4 members of the Avalon Naval Force. One of them approached, a rather tall, lanky man with long blonde hair. His hazel eyes had a no-nonsense look to them, but his demeanor screamed nonchalance. Zachary Sansei, I presume, Coreen said, nodding to the younger captain. So my reputation precedes me, Zachary snorted. I'm heading home to Avalon to see my Samantha, he said. Samantha? The way you're always in the news with that Alexiana girl, the world sees the two of you as a couple. Oh, shoot. Samantha, the way you're always in the news with that Alexiana girl, the world sees the two of you as a couple. Aris chimed in. Not likely, Lex. Not likely. Lex and I grew up together. She's like a sister to me. Land ho, the ferry's captain said as they docked. Standing at the dock was a short brown-haired woman, wearing a set of large glasses. She ran to Zachary and the two kissed. They disappeared into the crowd. From the port, it was an hour walk to the port city of Avalon. Coreen and his number of contacts had a number of contacts within, including the love of his life, Vanessa. Tyros went to his home near the Adventurers Guild, and Coreen went to Vanessa with Molly and Aris in tow. They knocked at the door. Soon an orange-haired woman with big blue eyes answered. She immediately, wordlessly, grabbed Coreen and kissed him. I missed you, she said, ushering them inside. When I heard the Benihana was shot down, I almost flipped. I'm glad you all survived, she said with a smile. Reese, Vanessa said, looking at the Felix intently, make yourself at home and please don't break anything. She said in reference to the Felix custom of breaking technology. Not this serval, miss, Reese said. Molly tilted her head. Miss Reese isn't your typical Felix mistress, Molly explained. The crew soon went to bed. The next morning there was a loud sound. Coreen woke and looked on as Koranin drones attacked the city of Avalon. Vanessa took refuge in the basement of her house. Coreen grabbed a drone mid-air using telekinesis, but it broke free due to the distance, hanging a U-turn and opening fire on him. He blocked the bolts with his sabers. He took cover behind a concrete outcropping and began to focus. Due to the drones being machines, the drones could not be detected by psychic means. One took a low altitude and floated right over him. He raised a saber and cut it in two. These drones were after someone, likely him. Along with that, they were smaller and more numerous than the ones that destroyed the Benihana. Another was frozen in ice some ways away. The source of the other was none other than A&F Corporal Samet. She may be a greenhorn, but she's already prodigiously strong. She rode an ice floe straight into the air and sliced a drone long ways. The rest of the A&F sprung into action behind Alexiana, and soon the drones were all mopped up. At this point, an airship appeared on the horizon. It was the A&F's missing airship, the Slytherin. As the Slytherin loomed over the horizon, the remaining airships of the A&F took to the sky with Zachary at the helm of the flagship, the Gryffindor. It was flanked by the Ravenclaw, the Hufflepuff, with the Azkaban taking up the rear. The Slytherin unleashed more drones, a capability the other ships didn't have. The A&F fleet made swift work of the Koranin drones. Soon the fleet was joined by Korana's flagship, the Hailstorm. It was piloted by Janiyah Winkler, Gloryhammer of Korana. For the Bond, she shouted from a megaphone. At her left and right stood Dragon Knight Ashios Land and the Felix Gynoid Kari Tenvers. Coreen looked at the great battle in the sky. With the airship Slytherin outnumbered, and the hailstorm sending out drones of its own to swarm the Slytherin, Zachary pulled the Gryffindor in close and boarded the ship, shooting a jet of green fire from his hand and melting the window, accessing the bridge. He locked eyes with the traitor, Bertrand Oakdrand. The would-be dictator surrounded himself with like-minded humans from Tatala and Korana. Ever the human supremacist, Oakdrand was once a commander of the A&F. Zachary disappears through the opening. About this time, Coreen sees Tyros fighting in the town square. Coreen rushes over and joins him. Molly and Aris join the fray too. Swarms of rebels rush in with swords, guns, spears, and clubs. Coreen grabbed one with telekinesis and slams him into another. Then two more in a wide arc. Aris acrobatically hops around, stabbing and kicking with her strong legs. Molly swung her fists, each having a piston inside for maximum damage. Thanks, everyone, Tiro said, slicing enemies with his katana, the Azure Requiem. Suddenly a bullet rings out and pierces Tyros' back. A lung collapses, and so does he. Coreen witnesses this and is overcome with fury. He cuts down the gunman and mops up the last of the enemies himself. As the battle rages in the sky, Coreen took to his mentor's side. The old pirate could barely speak, but managed the words, "Persevere, all of you," before expiring. "Aris, take Tyros's body and go to Berzara. Bury him there. I'm taking Molly and I'm going to kill this Uckdrand myself," Coreen explained. He then ran to the site of the airship battle with Molly. Molly fired a grappling hook from her wrist and she and Coreen rode it up. Coreen cut a hole in the hull long enough for them to step into he saw as the cargo what he saw in the cargo hold was carnage. The bodies of orcs, sator, atar, minotites, sahagin, felix, elves, dismembered and tormented to death. Coreen and Molly made their way out and into a hallway. Coreen vomited, and they kept moving. "Uckdrand will pay for this atrocity," Coreen raged. He followed the sound of the commotion above. Eventually, the pair found their way to the bridge where Janiyah and Zachary were already fighting. Coreen and Molly joined them. Eventually, they subdued Uckdrand's guards. However, Bertrand Uckdrand was nothing if not clever. He had prepared for this eventuality and electrified the floor. Molly immediately shudders, smokes, and in that instant her back panel explodes off in a shower of sparks. It wasn't long before the humans fainted. When Coreen awoke, he was in a cell. Zachary Sansi as his bunkmate. Explosive collars around their necks. "I hear movement. Sound off, please." It was Janiyah in the cell next to them. "I'm here, Gloryhammer," Coreen spoke up. "Privateer Drall, it's good to hear from you." "Sansa is in here too, but comatose, drooling even," Coreen said as Zachary began to snore. Meanwhile, Aris and Vanessa are on a ship to Belzara, the coffin containing Tyros's body in tow. They arranged for a plot by one of its mighty rivers. A day later they arrived and laid Tyros to rest. After the burial, Vanessa stepped to Aris and handed her Azure Requiem. Aris was surprised as the katana took on a blue hue in the sunlight. This enchanted blade protected Tyros for decades. "Now you are its master," Vanessa said. "What about Coreen?" Aris asked. "We'll need to work with the ANF and the Koranan Air Force to get him and Molly back," Vanessa responded. They offered a prayer for the departed, then left themselves boarding the ship to return to Avalon to prepare the way forward to get their captain back. The sun began to set as the ship shoved off. Reese sat up by the figurehead, staring up at the triple moon and the stars in the sky. She'd certainly gotten more than she'd bargained for. The black-haired Felix closed her eyes and fell asleep. Vanessa sat below deck, drinking. Worried for her husband, she soon fell asleep herself. Kyler arrived on the shores of Itara that evening. He headed to his home in the capital city and was greeted by his wife, a blonde-haired human named Sarah. They kissed. Coreen sat in his cell in a dark corner. It was almost time for Uckdrand to come in and gloat. Coreen began to meditate. At this point, Alexiana and her sister Mishra were receiving their mission to rescue Lieutenant Osborne. But that's a story for another day. The Slytherin had retreated and taken prisoners. To be continued in Discs of Jistoa. So that was the first of a series of origin stories. Now, I didn't write one for every character, but this is the first. I hope you enjoyed, and remember to like, share, and subscribe if you did. And Come on, brain, this isn't funny. Um, yeah. If you enjoyed, like, share, subscribe, and remember, with God on your side, no weapon set against you shall prosper. Thanks for watching.